Hello, everybody. Welcome to the EverydayFI podcast, the show that explores the lives and stories of everyday people in the financial independence community. Today on the show, I'm going to be talking to Alan, who I talked to for so long that I definitely have to split this episode into two parts. In part one, we talk about how he's raising teenage kids, which is a new topic for us on the show. I'm very excited about that. We also talk about him being in the sandwich generation as a Gen Xer and somebody who came to FI later in life. We also talk about how to talk to your aging parents about handling their money and the difficulties if they haven't handled it well up to this point. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Stay tuned to hear Alan's story. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the EverydayFI podcast again. So happy you're here. Today on the show, I'm going to be talking with my buddy, Alan. Alan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for letting me do this and having me on your show. And by the way, let me just say that listening to your show, you would think this is episode 300. I mean, you do this so well. It is so polished and so professional and so amazing. I've listened to when Keith was on, when Justin was on, when various people, various friends of mine have been on, and just, you listen to a lot of podcasts that begin and they're getting their feet underneath them. But I just wanted to tell you that I just really love how polished and how well you've put this together. So super proud to be on this podcast at this time, because I think it's an exciting start to something.
Thank you so much. That is so sweet. I'm not crying. You're crying. Thank you.
You're so welcome. It's so well deserved. So yeah, Florida man. I was originally Georgia man and moved to Florida, met my wife, we have a couple of kids, and we have a big dopey dog named Magic, big Labrador retriever. And we live in Central Florida, and we're both, my wife and I are technology people, or I was a technology person. I retired in 2022. My wife still runs an S Corp. She runs her own consulting business. And so when I retired in 2022, I started to focus just on helping her with her business a little bit, and also kind of becoming Mr. Mom a little bit around the house. I left my tech career. I like to cook. I like to do a lot of projects around the house and different things like that. So yeah, and we're just, our kids are teenagers. One has graduated from high school. The other one is still in high school. And so we're really focused on helping them to get to the next stage in life. I think that's our biggest project as it is today.
Yeah, having teenagers, I can't even imagine.
I've heard it in the FI community that, kids are cheap. Kids are inexpensive. No, babies are inexpensive. The boy teenager eats like a family of four. So we're now buying, 2 gallons of milk every grocery trip, as opposed to 1 gallon of milk every 2 weeks. And it's amazing. And then teenagers like to drive, and there's a lot more to a teenager, I would say, than there is to a toddler. They're easy to trick and boss around, but teenagers, not so much.
Yeah, for sure. I'd actually like to explore that topic a little bit, because I don't think we've had anybody on here who has had teenage kids or who has spoken about having teenage kids. I remember having a mom on, I believe it was Erin G, and I'm going to link the episode, but
I know Erin. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think she mentioned that having kids was pretty cheap, that she was able to do a lot of cheap stuff, but I think she has younger kids. And so I'd love to know what your perspective as having teens. I mean, you kind of alluded to some of it, but I'm even thinking, how quickly teens grow. And I know that little kids grow quickly too, but you can get away with buying them used clothes on, Facebook Marketplace or whatever. Teenagers, not so much, because they need to look cool and they need to be able to fit in and things like that. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of, too, is that I think we were not very thoughtful in how we were going to introduce our teens to certain things. So, for example, I mean, we only found the FI movement maybe in 2018. My wife and I are both in our 50s, so we're kind of late comers to the movement. And there's some advantages to that, and there's some disadvantages to that. We would have much rather been the people in our 20s who found the FI movement. Because when I go to Camp FIs and all these, I see all these young people, and I say, you guys are so far ahead of where we were, but we didn't find it till our late 40s. And then we started to apply the principles. There's some advantages again to kind of, you already have some assets and you're maybe already tired of buying junk and cleaning out the garage for the 50th time and stuff like that. So as you get in your 50s, it's not too late. It's a perfect time to start doing FI principles. Our kids were young, and yes, I 100% agree. They were very inexpensive. We can get hand-me-down clothes. I don't think we bought clothes for our kids through their entire young people age, whether it be gifts or hand-me-downs or whatever. They just never had them. And even as teenagers, actually, my kids have been pretty good about going and trying to find a deal at Goodwill or something like that, and just sort of bragging that they've got a shirt for $2 and all of that. I don't think I've ever paid more than $60 for a prom dress, stuff like that. So they've been fantastic about that. But I think there's just more. So if you make a decision, for example, to say, well, do I want my kids to drive? Do I want to give them their first car at 16? As an example, there are so many kids in our area who aren't driving. And I think that's a life skill. I think it's a skill that you need to know and learn how to drive, but there's a cost with that. Your car insurance increases when your kids get their license. And then if your oldest happens to hypothetically, a wink, wink, run into another driver, then your insurance even goes higher. And so car insurance gets crazy. I've already mentioned your grocery bill goes up. There's just various little sort of cost of living things that go up. And I wouldn't trade it. I mean, I wouldn't, that doesn't say don't have kids. They are amazing parts of our lives and all of that. I think J.L. Collins said that he never bought a car for his kids, for example. And I think I heard that on a podcast one time. And, we had kind of thought about that. Like, well, what if we simply say, look, you're not going to drive until you can afford to drive and all of that. But in the end, we sort of made that decision to go ahead and get them going on that. Certainly helps with us not having to take them everywhere that they want to go. And I think it helps them, particularly in Florida, because we don't have city culture. We don't live in a place where they can just easily hop on public transit and get to a job and stuff like that. So, they're going to need a car and to be able to drive to have any kind of economic future. So we made that decision. But yeah, it's not free. It's not super cheap. And then there's some growing pains as they are transitioning from teenagers into adulthood. They're going to get little things like little parking tickets, or just little things happen that kids are learning what they can and can't do and what they should and should do and shouldn't do and stuff like that. So yeah, not free. They grow up.
Yeah. You sound like a great dad because, I mean, when I got into a wreck, the only wreck that I ever got into that was my fault, by the way, it was 3 months after I got my driver's license. I was in my big, huge 1990 Oldsmobile Silhouette minivan with all of my friends in the back. They had the lights on, they were all yelling, and I was backing out of a driveway and I just wasn't looking and hit a car.
Mm.
And my dad and my stepmom blew up at me. I mean, they were screaming at me, but it sounds like you're very much like, you know what, kids are kind of learning what they can and can't do. I kind of want to approach it that way. Like, okay, my kid is, kind of a little bit, doesn't know their way around the world because they've only been here for 16 years. So I like that.
A little bit of that is podcast dad versus, where do I go out in the yard and just scream at the sky and then come back in and try to put on a good face. So, I can just give you an example. I was actually on the Camino de Santiago when my daughter rear-ended another driver. So another driver brake checked her. So I called her from Spain and I asked her if she was okay. And, she was crying. And as soon as you hear your daughter crying, you can't yell and you can't lecture. All you can do is say, are you okay? And wait for mom, and mom's on her way and all of that kind of stuff. But when she does something, or when they have something like, well, maybe she gets a speeding ticket. Well, I got speeding tickets as a kid, stuff like that. The main coachable moment I think I give my kids is the time to involve mom and I, the time to tell us when things like that happen. is when they happen. Don't be afraid and not want to tell us. And then it's, 60 days and we get a letter in the mail. So my frustration is things happen. Things are going to happen, but we're on your side ultimately. Yes, I may scream and yell and holler and whatever. And I try to do that at the sky alone versus in front of you. But at the end of the day, we're on your team and you need to involve your team when things happen. And so that's where I'm kind of trying to guide them, is just make sure that we're involved in that.
Yeah, I love that. In a very subtle way, it's showing them that you matter and you're worthy no matter what mistakes you make, because we will love you no matter what you do. And I love that. I love that approach. So I have two questions. One is about letting your kids work, and one is about college. So I'm going to ask the college one first. Are you saving for their college, or did you start saving for their college in like a 529 account when they were younger? And did you increase that over time? Does that add to the cost of having a teenager? Or would you say that that's just a cost that's over the whole life of them being a child?
We did do 529s. And again, this was pre Alan and Miley finding the FI movement. And I know that there's circles in the FI movement that the 529 is still a big part of it. I don't love the 529 now that we're kind of in the execution part of it. I know that they recently changed laws where you can sort of roll 529 money into a Roth IRA for your kids in a certain amount. But when we set up 529s, when we did my daughter's, she was 2, and we would put a set amount in every month. When my daughter was 2, I was like, she's going to be a Stanford girl. She's going to, you have all of these expectations and I guess projections that you put on your kids as a family. But as she got into junior high, it was kind of clear that smart kid, but not an academic. By the time she got through high school, it was clear that she was not going to, I think we could have forced her to go to college, but she would not have thrived in college. I think that she needs to mature a little bit. And so we're giving her space to do that. We went to a little career school, little technical school, because we said, well, you need some kind of job. You need to work because, if you're not going to be in college or in school, you're going to do some kind of job or whatever. And what I proposed is we do this little career school close by. It's only a 3-month program and it teaches you how to be a medical assistant. So a medical assistant is this person who, when you go to the doctor and they call you back and they do your weight and height and blood pressure and they sort of set you up for a doctor coming in. And, it's a career that when we were sort of talking to my oldest had some experience in the restaurant industry and then also, and was thinking, well, maybe I could go on to waitressing, whatever. And so we talked about maybe medical assistant because it's almost like from a money perspective, it's probably pretty lateral to someone who's working in food service, but it's a higher ladder. In other words, you can kind of get exposure to say, oh, well, what does a radiographer do? What does a nurse do? What does a sonographer do? And so that she can get exposure to a lot of these different jobs. And then I think as she kind of matures a little bit, she can kind of figure out, okay, if I do want to go back and do school, at least have some sense of what she wants to go back and do school for. The reason I tie this into the 529 is because the little career school that we chose, it wasn't a lot of money, but you're kind of limited into even which schools you can use on a 529. So those schools have to be within this FAFSA database. And there's just loads and loads of career schools that simply aren't in that financial aid database. So we took money out of her 529 to pay for this career school. But from an IRS perspective, I don't think that they're going to look at that money as being used for an approved expense, even though we kind of sent her to a career school to learn. So we're going to keep it in the 529. We're not going to roll it into any Roth IRA because we think that when she gets maybe 24, 25, that she's going to probably approach her education a bit more from a more mature life experience perspective. And she's going to need that money to really do that. My son is a completely different animal. My son is stressed out if he doesn't get a 95 on something, or he is blowing the curve in AP chemistry where the average class is 57 and he's getting a 93. I mean, he is academically very, very focused, and he likely also won't use the 529 money because he'll most likely get a full ride. We have something in Florida called Bright Futures, and if you have a certain GPA and a certain amount of volunteer hours and all of that, then your education is basically paid for at public universities. I can already see that he's going to qualify for all of that, probably also some additional funds. So his 529 money will sit there. I suppose we could roll that into something down the road. But I'm just not sure that we wouldn't have been better off, honestly, just from a flexibility perspective. I just feel like that the benefit is in the margins, and I'm not sure that we wouldn't have just benefited by creating custodial accounts for them and buying mutual funds and then just letting them rip. And now they have money if they need money and stuff like that. So I know it's kind of probably a weird take on 529s, but they're just for our specific situation, they haven't been terrible, but I feel like there's a lot of stuff that you just don't know about your kids when you need to set those things up, that it's just kind of hard to see the future, you know?
I actually don't think it's a weird take at all. I think it's more common, especially these days, because of what student loans did to our two generations, right? Gen X and millennials and even Gen Z are going to be paying those loans forever. And it's so expensive to go to college. And a lot of the time, you're not always using the degree. I have a master's degree in art history and I'm not using it. Like I
Hmm.
work in tech. So,
Yeah.
and I will say I don't regret going to college. I really enjoyed my time and I enjoyed learning, but that was, an $80,000 enjoyment. I did want to reference something that I learned on the Her Money podcast. I was looking it up while you were speaking about your daughter. There's something called Degree Free where they do counseling and coaching for younger people to figure out what they want to do in life. And it doesn't center on going to college. It's like
Mm.
they do assessments where their strengths are. And then they kind of say, okay, here's some options that you might want to do. And then they also take into account that, hey, you're 16, 17, 18, you're a child. You're not going to know if what you want to do right now is what you're going to continue wanting to do when you're 30, 40, 50. And so it's a really great resource. I'll link the interview with the founder on Her Money, and I will also link to the actual website in the show notes. It's something that my partner and I want to do with our kids because I want to encourage them to do what they want to do. I don't think that a degree is necessary. And I think it's going to be less necessary as the world moves on and as the kind of like old guard starts to retire and get out of the workforce and a newer guard comes in and is like, I don't really care about a degree. I care if you can do the job and, what your kind of core asset as a professional is, not necessarily a degree. So yeah, I don't think it's weird at all. So
Okay.
yeah.
Good. Shoo.
Not that you needed my validation, but
No,
um,
I constantly do. I think that when your kids are young, the world is their oyster a little bit, right? And I think things start to come in to a little more focus when they get older, and you as a parent kind of know your kid. So I know my kid. I know whether or not I have to worry about my kid going to a party or not, because I know my kid. I know what they're going to do, what they're not going to do. You learn that because you grow up with them and you really understand them. And I think that as all of that starts to come into focus, you kind of know things like, are they going to thrive in college? Are they going to thrive in a certain type of job? Different things like that. So to me, we've had our kids take some tests and things. And I can also tell you just back a napkin, I'm like, I know what my oldest is going to thrive at, and I know what my youngest is going to thrive at. I know those kinds of things pretty well. And so I would say, just to parents and future parents out there, it's a bit of like what we owe. What do we owe our kids? From our perspective, most of our focus goes into helping them realize a good life in this world, and we'll give almost anything to help that. But there's always this balance or this tension of where do we kind of let them fail and mess up and learn for themselves. And we don't want to go on job interviews with them. I've read where parents are going on job interviews with their kids and all, we don't want to do that. So we're kind of trying to always find this balance between when are we coaching, giving them some advice, and when are we letting them kind of go and make the same mistakes that we did, because our kids will come out with some harebrained scheme of something that they're going to do, and we'll smile and we'll nod, and then we'll kind of say to each other, oh, well, I mean, we made mistakes like that you got to let them kind of go and sort of make those mistakes, or maybe it works out for them or not. And so it's always an adventure with kids, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. It's when I was a kid, my parents gave me a lot of autonomy, and I think they did that because it just made it a little bit easier for them too. They didn't have to, helicopter parent me, and so they allowed me to do things on my own. And I mean, half the time I'm grateful for that because it definitely molded me into an adult who figures her life out.
Mhm.
And even when I run up on something that's not going well, for instance, so my first leg of my career was in art history and museum studies. And I'm not going to say I failed at it, but it just didn't work out. And so I pivoted into the tech world. And now this is working out pretty well. And even in the tech world, there were some jobs that didn't quite work out. And so I pivoted there as well. And I really chalk that up to my parents giving me that autonomy. Now, on the other hand, I have been in therapy now and have learned that amount of autonomy that they gave me might not have been the best from an emotional standpoint. There were some things that I had to work through because I didn't get that much love and attention from my parents that I needed. So there, like you said, there really is this balance that you have to do as a parent to let your kid do their thing, but also be there for them and show them that you don't have to be independent. You can rely on us too. It sounds like you're doing that very well, and I commend you for that. And I actually kind of leading into another question about this. Do you let your kids work and have a job? Do they want to do that? And if they did, would you let them do that?
Yeah. So going back to know your kid, right? So sometimes what happens is that things just kind of happen before you have time to give it a lot of thought. And so my daughter came home one day and said, I got a job today at a burger joint. And I didn't really have time to think about it. I didn't have an opportunity beforehand to say, well, is this the right thing to do? And so you learn more on the second kid, I think, than you learn a lot from the first kid to make good decisions on the second kid. I don't know if there's a right answer. I would say this, that my daughter has a lot going on and also had a bit of therapy as well. And so you also start to look at, well, am I worried about academic numbers and, made up tests to tell you how valuable you are as a person and a human and whatever. And I would just say it bothered my daughter that she wasn't really good at school. And so there was, again, a transition I think that we had to make where we were like, okay, we have to worry about the whole human being here and not necessarily just a grade or a GPA or whether you got into this school, whether you got it all worked out and planned out. So in retrospect, I think a job was good because a job gave her some validation that she could do things and that it gave her busyness versus just time sitting on a phone or social media or something like that. It gave her money to do some things with her friends that brought her joy at a time where she didn't always have joy. And so from that perspective, she sort of created her own treatment to something that maybe she wasn't getting from the academic world and all of it. So I was behind that in retrospect, but didn't have a lot of input on it because it just sort of happened before you as a parent kind of, your kids will create unique ways to make you sort of double think as a parent. Well, wait, should we be allowing this or should we not be allowing this? Well, it's already in motion. And how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube kind of thing? It's just kind of tough. My second kid, my younger, who I said he's very academically focused and whatever, he has a job. But, again, he creates his own boundaries around that. So he'll tell you, I only want to work 1 day a week. It's going to be on Sundays. I'm going to work 3 hours so it doesn't get in the way of my academics. So someone who's academically oriented, I mean, we didn't have to draw that up for him. We didn't have to kind of put those guardrails in place. He put them in place himself because he values class time. He values time to work on his assignments, and his chemistry is completely different when it comes to all that. So both kids worked. My daughter worked a lot more than my son did because she had different ideas about the whole teenage ecosystem and what she needed to do to sort of survive and be happy and all of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And to me, my first thought when you told me that your daughter came to you and said, I got a job, I was like, wow, what an industrious person, that she just took the initiative to go get a job because she knew she wanted one. Because I think so many people worry about the younger generations being lazy and on their phones all the time, right? But your daughter is not. So that's amazing. And then I also love how your son was like, no, I know what's important to me. And I do want a job because I want that experience, but I also know what's valuable to me. And I'm going to make sure that my life is set up in a way that's like that. I mean, they sound like little adults already.
Oh, yeah.
I don't remember being able to do that when I was a kid, but yeah, that's amazing. So, okay, speaking of kids, let's start talking about your money story and some of your history with money and your parents and things like that. So, why don't you tell me what one of your first money memories was as a kid?
I was a Gen X kid. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I was a kid. I wore the little corduroy bell-bottom pants and the little flannel shirts. I remember. So I have one distinct memory about our family. So my parents did, I think, a really good job of creating the illusion of middle class. But there were, they didn't have to say that they were kind of paycheck to paycheck, but there were signs. I mean, I think we would go to like a Red Lobster once a month, for example. And really, even when I was 14, 15 years old, it was still expected that I was going to order off the 12-year-old menu. And that just bothered me as a kid to no end because you're trying to grow up and be something, and to go and as a teenage boy, 15 years old, I don't know, it's Thanksgiving and you're sitting at the kids table with your 6-year-old cousins and stuff. You just don't like it. And then you go to the restaurant and you're finally getting just a hint of what you hope is a mustache and whatever. And then they're plopping down. And I kind of looked young. I mean, even when I was 15, I probably looked about 10 because all of us Gen X kids, we were just rail thin. You ate 3 meals a day. There was not a house full of snacks or anything like that. And we were outside all the time. And so I probably looked 10. And so I would constantly get that little menu laid down in front of me with the connect the dots lobster on it and stuff like that. And, I would just begrudgingly order my popcorn shrimp and move on. But it created this thing where my own kids, when we would go to restaurants, I refused to let them ever have a kids menu. I was anti-frugal when it came to my kids. And now post-fi, I would love to be able to order off the kids menu myself. Like I would love to be able to do that. Like that's full circle. But when my kids were, 9, 10 years old, something like that, I would insist that they could order off the big menu. And I think that was just trauma from my own experience and how that made me feel. I remember we had a county fair, and I did truly have sort of rich dad, poor dad, in the sense my best friend, his dad owned a pharmaceutical wholesale company. And I remember we would go and do things with them. We would go to the county fair and stuff like that. I remember distinctly one time we wanted to go off by ourselves, and his dad handed him a $20 bill to go have fun with. And I looked at my dad And I could just see he wanted to keep up with that. He did reach into his wallet, gave me a $20 bill, but we had this exchange in our eyes. I knew that at the end of the night, I needed to give him that $20 bill back. That was not to be spent. It was for that moment, for that performance, and that's it. So I knew that we had money issues, even though we always had dinner, we always had 75 cents to take for lunch that day. We always had things we needed. But I also knew that there were just things that we would not or could not spend money on as well. I mean, that was pretty evident, but that was my earliest memory. And I didn't really have allowances. I didn't have a job growing up, but we would always get birthday money from my grandfather. My grandfather always stuffed a $20 bill or $40 in a birthday card, and you'd get it. And I would make that last all year. Like I was a miserly little kid. So scarcity mindset gets thrown around a lot. I think from my perspective as a kid, I was pretty frugal. I have three other siblings. I'm the youngest of four kids. And so the playbook in our family was when you turned 16, my dad would get you your first car. It was usually like a $500 car, if you can imagine, which, you know, in the 70s and 80s is fine. But I also knew that as soon as a kid started driving in the house, that their insurance would go up. So I delayed, like I told a lie. So I told my parent that I wasn't ready to drive yet. But in reality, what I was worried about was adding more insurance costs to the family. So I didn't drive until my senior year in high school. I was already like, I think I waited a year and a half before I actually drove. And even then, I had already been working. So, you know, I would have like a lot of money and I would just say, Dad, take this big wad of cash. And he never did. I mean, to his credit, he said, no, save your money and all of that. But I mean, just little things like that. I knew that we weren't as bad off as some people, but I also knew that we probably weren't as good off as maybe our house and cars would lead you to believe, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like your dad, when you were describing the $20 bill exchange, like he was trying to save face in front of
Yeah.
somebody who he saw as his peer. And it's not quite keeping up with the Joneses because he wasn't actually following that lifestyle, but it was like I don't want this other person to know our struggles with money or our need to be frugal. And I just have to commend you for being such a considerate child that you didn't want to burden your parents with more cost because you saw what it did. I just think that's incredibly commendable, but also it's just like it's, it hurts my heart to do it, and it's so sweet. And you know, how do you feel about that today when you're looking back on those kinds of situations, and how do you take those kinds of lessons that you learned as a kid into your adulthood?
I think that my parents spent money on certain things and they didn't spend money on other things. I had plastic leather compatible sneakers from TG&Y, which was a little store before Walmart even was a thing in our town. And all of that. At school, Gen X kids were pretty cool at school. So Gen X kids would call the kind of shoes that I wore buddies. They would say, "Oh, you got those buddies." It was like if the Converse has three stripes, your buddies had four. Or it wasn't the Nike swish, it was a swish kind of going down in the opposite direction or whatever. They weren't leather, they were kind of whatever this leather material was. So there were things that we just simply did not spend money on. And I would say today makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you've ever seen a kid's foot grow, you don't want to put them in $75 shoes while their feet are still growing and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't begrudge any of that stuff as a kid. What I do worry about is that they didn't really save for their own retirement. They didn't really save for their own long-term care. They put everything that they had into creating a good today for their family and for their kids. And so we had a new car every few years. and we had a pool put in a couple of times, like all of these kinds of things. But, I didn't know at the time that a lot of that was at the expense, you know, and I don't even know how prevalent 401ks were back then. I do know that my dad's job didn't really offer like a pension plan. So it's, 70s, 80s, it was sort of on the cusp of the 401k being adopted more and more and companies sort of moving out of the pension plans and stuff like that. And I don't know what his sort of retirement options, his savings options were, but I think I took more away as they started to get older. So we started to kind of see, because we started out the same way. Let me just say that when I was working, this miserly little kid that used to exist, as soon as I started to work, I started to spend money freely. I even had this attitude that, well, I'm young, I'm smart. My capacity to earn is way greater than my capacity to save. That's the way I always kind of thought about it. And it sounds catchy. It's dumb, but it sounds catchy to say that. And so I didn't really learn that lesson until my parents started to get to an age where, my dad's salary was probably too big for the balance sheet and that they had to declare bankruptcy. He had been going through an increased number of layoffs as he got older and older. You become sort of less appealing to the workforce because you're expensive. They question how long you'll be there. I mean, you know, I know there are laws, but ageism is a thing in corporate America. And so I saw sort of his options kind of running out, and I saw that he really did not have the security of like a pension or a security of a big, retirement account or whatever. So they basically had to go from living, so they sort of had a middle class income, but they were living sort of an upper class lifestyle. Because, when you're using credit cards and all of that, you're not living a middle class life. You're living a very lucrative, upper class life. So think about going from that sort of debt spending, but also high income, eat out whenever you want, get a great car whenever you want, to going to all of a sudden now the party's over and you now have to live off Social Security. And Social Security is maybe one quarter, one third of what you're used to earning. And then above and beyond that, what you're actually spending because you're creating a deficit of your credit card. So going from that extreme to the other extreme destroyed their marriage, just destroyed their marriage. All of us who have read Mr. Money Mustache, we look at what he lives on and we're like, well, you have $2,400 over here and $800 over there, and you can combine those together, and that's still 40, 50 grand a year. And Mr. Money Mustache lives on that, or Justin at Root of Good, they live on that just fine. And so, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that frugality takes practice. You can't go from one extreme to another without going through just stress and just shock. And so when they went through that, it sort of was a wake up call for us about what not to do. And so we started to kind of try and get things in order. So we started out with just, well, why don't we pay off our house? We always have somewhere to live. And, why don't we put away $10,000 in an emergency fund? We weren't really Dave Ramsey people, but it seemed like we were doing kind of Dave Ramsey kind of stuff. We were just trying to get to something better than what we were doing because we started out just like they were. I mean, we bought a townhome, then we bought a house, and then we bought a really big house. And then we ended up moving into a more modest house, and we were upscaling our life. I mean, we bought a little camper, then a big camper, and then we had to buy a new vehicle to tow the big camper. We started out just making a lot of money, spending almost all of it. We were very fortunate not to go in debt, but by gosh, we spent all of it. Luckily, we at least did our 401ks and stuff like that. We at least put something aside that was sort of automated and sort of invisible to us. But everything we got outside of that, we just spent. And I think when all of that happened to my parents, it made us start to think about saving a little money on a post-tax basis just so that we had some liquidity in case anything ever happened to our jobs and all of that kind of stuff. But we were so naive back then about even how investing worked because we didn't really have any sort of financial mentors growing up that said, hey, here's how compounding works and here's the magic of that. We didn't know any of that to the point where I would have these very simple things in my mind of, oh, well, we make $100,000 a year. And if I look at our retirement account, we've got about 250,000. That means we can live about 2.5 years. Like it didn't occur to me that retirement is not about what you earn, it's about what you spend and all of that. So even none of that just even made sense. I thought that if I wanted 10 years of retirement, that I needed to save $1 million, and after 10 years it would all be gone because it's just really dumb thoughts about kind of because I just had no idea. So that came later as far as learning a little bit about how to invest and how to think about investing, which was really transformative. But I don't think we woke up to any of that until like my parents went through what they went through, and then we were like, wow, I started to get a lot of deep anxiety about all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much in what you just said. And going back to your parents not saving enough, it's interesting to think about it. And we can go off and say, well, what were they thinking? That's so irresponsible. But no, when you think about today and the amount of, I'm going to call it privilege that we have, because we have so much access to not only different accounts, like you said, 401ks. I think those came around in the 80s, I want to say. And even then, there wasn't the internet. So you had to call somebody to buy things, right? And
Hmm.
so there was a lot more barrier to entry, and even back then, there was probably not, again, with the internet, there wasn't a swath of information on the internet to learn this stuff. Now, the flip side of that is now there's probably a little too much on the internet, and now you don't really know what's right for you, and you really have to go into a rabbit hole to figure it out. And then also, it's not taught in schools, so you don't even know that you need to be figuring this out. So there's the other side of that coin. But I feel like we can give older generations a little bit of grace because, they didn't have that privilege of that level of access. And if you didn't have a pension, then you weren't taught that there was somewhere else to put it, then I can kind of understand your parents going through that. Another thing you talked about is when you live a certain lifestyle, having to scale back from that is probably one of the hardest things that you can do. And I find it interesting that that's kind of a common theme with people who retire. They're like, "Oh, I'm just going to downsize." And I'm like, you're saying that like you think it's easy. I don't think it's as easy as you think it is. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't want to leave their homes where they had a family of, five, six, seven living in this massive home. And now it's only one or two of them and they don't need this home anymore. But they're like, oh, all my kids grew up here. I don't want to get rid of it, even though they
Hmm.
really don't need the 5-bedroom house anymore. I think that's a lot harder than I think people realize. I think even my mom is going through some of that right now. Like she has a house that's probably a little too big for her needs. And for her, downsizing would mean living more central to her city. And it actually is going to be the same cost. So she's like,
Hmm.
I'm just going to keep my big home in the suburbs because I don't want to buy a smaller home in the city, even though it's more central, because it's going to be the same cost.
There's one thing I wanted to kind of point out on the whole idea of, sort of this sudden forced downsizing, right? That can be so traumatic for people. I think the skill there that we are still trying to cultivate and grow is our ability and willingness to change. We were at a family gathering the other day and something came up about, the cost of living in Florida has gotten really crazy with homeowners, and there's a homeowners and insurance, house insurance crisis here, and auto insurance. 1 in 4 Floridians are not insured at all in auto, and it's getting to be, I think, 1 in 5 Floridians are going naked. They're not even insuring their homes. And so here's the thing for us in this family gathering. What came up was this idea that Miley and I have been talking about for a long time, but I just kind of said, because I think they were talking about buying new cars or something. And I said, I don't want to own anything. at this point in my life. I don't want to own anything. And they're like, well, wait, what about your house? Like, our house is paid off. And I'm like, okay, yeah, our house is paid off, but my oldest doesn't want to live in Florida. She wants to go ultimately and start her new life somewhere else. And, I think that our kids in general are going to have to be willing to move around and travel in order to get the job that they want. Whatever they decide to do may not be a job that's here in Polk County, Florida. And so they're going to have to move around. And it's this idea that, you know, my kids are willing to change and adapt and go somewhere where the job is. And our house has never really been sort of the gathering place anyway. Like, we typically go to a relative's house for things like Thanksgiving and Christmas and stuff like that. So our house is just kind of a vessel. It's just a bit of a shell. But we don't see in our family, for our perspective, we don't see this future where Miley and I are just sort of walking around a big empty house and we're waiting for our kids to break away from their busy lives and come visit. And we keep their rooms exactly the way it was with Legos and blah, blah, blah. That's not our idea of what our second life is. I heard this phrase from Jimmy Carr, the comedian. He said, we all have two lives, and the second one starts when you realize you've only got one. And that's where my wife and I have been, is like, we know that our kids are going to go out, they're going to start their own adventure. We will always be there for them, but we are also not going to hang around. So when I say, well, we don't really want to own anything, it's because we're not going to sort of carry this big 3-bedroom house and the insurance and the taxes, and the septic system will need replacing at some point, and a new roof again at some point, and a new hot water heater, and the pool gets resurfaced. And we're not going to sort of carry this relic with us into our 80s. And we've done really good at decluttering. We've done really good at digitizing memories that we want to maintain. But our biggest skill is our willingness to change and our willingness to adapt. And we're not willing to sort of stay in a situation that doesn't serve us. So I think people were very surprised when we said we don't really want to own anything. We just honestly want to be renters for a while. We've been working on learning Spanish for about 3 to 4 years now. And we've been to Mexico a lot, and not Mexico like a lot of people experience Mexico through a cruise ship, and they get off and they hit the resort and then they get back on the cruise ship. I mean, we've gone to a lot of the colonial cities in central Mexico and gotten to really appreciate the country and culture. So we want to spend some time there. We have plans for our life that are, I would say, just for 5 people in general. I think 5 people in general are very unconventional. I think 5 people in general don't fit the template. Otherwise, why would we all be here? We would all be working as we all do and putting a little bit aside and just going through life, and then kind of getting, to the end game and in the same house that we've had for 40 years and we start a garden, I guess. I don't know. But it's not for us. And I've always said, I kind of find that a lot of people in the FI community, we think differently. We accept way more variability in what we're willing to do in our lives. And I've always said we're a bit like the island of misfit toys. I know that that's one of the reasons why I left corporate America, because I never really fit in. I never really found that I belonged there. I swallowed it down for 30 years. I did. But, in the end, I was like, gosh, this seems like we can make this money work.
I know it's important to you to talk about being a sandwich generation, so I'd love to get into your thoughts and how you're dealing with having parents that didn't save anything and having to take care of them, and then also having teen kids.
I think that everybody has a different situation going here. But if you're in your 20s and you're in your 30s, I would encourage you really to evaluate and have conversations with your parents about what their financial situation is. what siblings do you have and what is their relationship as well in all of this? I mentioned that my parents' marriage was really sort of destroyed by this sort of sudden drop into Social Security. And so, we've kind of had to work on getting them each into sort of a place and a state of mind where we could continue to have some sense of harmony and all of that. But it tears down a bit of the patriarchy. And I don't mean patriarchy in terms of the negative tone of patriarchy. I'm talking more about when you have a family and a dad and a mom, and they've always provided sort of some kind of guidance forward and some kind of assistance and help forward. And when all that breaks down, our family sort of lost its focus. We no longer had big Thanksgiving gatherings, big Christmas gatherings. So, on my wife's side, they've kept it all together. So we tend to go and do that a lot. But the soul of the family was kind of lost because all of that broke apart. And so when you have parents that have financially prepared, not only financially prepared, but mentally prepared as well, that they understand that they're going to have to make certain moves at certain stages of life. You've won the lottery of parents when that happens. Like if you've got parents and they've got the means, but they've also got a pretty level head to say there'll come a time, and we'll all have to deal with that, by the way, as FI people too. We do a lot of interesting things financially. We do things like Roth conversions. We consider all kinds of little tricks and hacks and things like that. And a lot of these tricks and hacks, in my opinion, in our situation, they have to be settled by the time we get in our 70s and 80s, because when we're in our 70s and 80s, I don't know that I'm going to have the mental. I'm going to really give everything to my youngest and say, hey, you need to manage our money at some point so that I don't give it all to a Nigerian prince, right? So you're just going to have to do that. We're going to figure out sort of what those are. But I just, with my parents, I think we just had a scare with my dad where after one of the hurricanes, I think he got off of his medication. And so as soon as he sort of skipped medication, well, there's certain medications that they take that once you skip those, it can really cause a lot of brain fog. It can cause a lot of really heavy dementia symptoms and stuff like that. And, we brought him in and got him back on a schedule of his medication and food and stuff like that. But it was really, really hard. It was a hard 4 days in our home. And we figured out that we're going to have to find ways to help our parents, but the way that we can't help our parents is that we can't throw a blanket over them and bring them in and give them a room. In our situation, we've figured out that's not what we can do. We owe too much to our future, to our kids, to all of that, that we have to find ways to help them that doesn't involve us emptying our retirement savings, and that doesn't involve us, having someone wander our house at night, not knowing maybe where they are right now and telling our kids, you need to lock your doors and just different things like that. So it's terrifyingly sad, I think, what some of our elderly and our parents are facing. And we're still navigating like what kind of services do we help them? So my dad was a veteran, so the VA, for example, might provide a lot of different sort of assisted living services and stuff like that. But there's also this aspect of, okay, we have all of those services. He's not willing yet to really acknowledge that he needs to supplement maybe some of his care to someone else. And so it's this idea that they have to be willing to change. They have to be willing to understand and sort of see that, look, you want to be part of that change. If that change happens when you're in crisis, I don't think that we're as good at picking the right situation because we're in crisis and we have to act in crisis, or I would say react in crisis. So it's a little bit for us about having those conversations to say, listen, while you have a good mind, what kinds of things do we need to do so that if you ever need assisted living, for example, I'm sure there are waiting lists for assisted living places. What do we need to do to get on those lists? How long will those lists take? How will we pay for those facilities? Different things like that. What does memory care look like? There is a lot of unknowns that we're kind of navigating through right now, but we're navigating it through the lens of two people who don't have anything. They don't have assets to be able to sort of draw down and pay for this stuff. So really it's about, okay, well, there's these things called Miller trusts. So if my dad makes a little bit too much from his Social Security, you can carve out this qualified income trust, and then you can kind of split off the money to where some of it goes to his needs and the other gets sort of calculated into whether or not he qualifies for Medicaid. So there's a lot of that stuff that we're just trying to sort of solve with our brain. And so there's the math of it, but then there's also the emotional side of it. And there's the, again, getting them to think about how their life is changing. And, the worst thing that you can do is you can say, well, listen, we're going to change our life and your friends are going to change their life. We're all going to turn everything we have and are upside down so that your life doesn't have to change. That's maybe not the right way to go about it because, again, we owe a future to our children. And part of that future is that if we empty our bank accounts, then we just kick the can down the road. And now it's our kids taking care of us. So we're very sympathetic, but at the same time, we're very, very clear-eyed about what we can and can't do, no matter how crazy and sad it may sound, you know.
Yeah, and there's so much there. And it's something that it's really different for everybody when you're dealing with your parents and hoping that they did what they needed to. And then if you find out that they didn't, how do you approach that? It's going to be different for everybody, but I like the advice that if you're in your 20s and 30s to start those conversations now so that you can normalize them and make it less triggering to have conversations about money. And it's something that I wish I had done. So I'm lucky on one half of my parentage and unlucky on the other half. So my mom completely planned out. She was CFO at Berkshire Hathaway, so she's got her stuff together, right? And her parents also did. And so I think that, like you said, kicking the can down the road, it works the other way, right? Because her parents, she didn't have to take care of them. And she has 5 siblings, or there's 5 of them. She has 4 siblings. They all chipped in to help out later in life whenever her parents needed visitors when they were in nursing care. Everybody chipped in. And so that allowed her to set up her future very well. And we have talked about it extensively about what she wants to do, what her plans will be. Not quite in detail, but she said, I want to do what my parents did for you. And then on the other side of it, I have my father, who is a very intelligent man. He was a lawyer and then changed careers to be a nurse. But when it comes to money, he does not want to talk to me about it. I mean, so I've actually called him a couple of times in the last couple of days just to talk, and he won't answer the phone because there's something going on with his late mother's property. And I think he doesn't want to talk to me about it. I'm not sure what happened, but it sounds like there's something bad that happened and he doesn't want to talk about it. And he's 77, so he's a lot older. He had me when he was 40, so he's a much older parent. And I think that generation of man doesn't know how to have emotions and express emotions. And when they have really big emotions, they just shut down. And that's kind of how it's going. And so anytime I bring up finance stuff, he's just like, I don't want to talk about this. And so I don't know what to do. I'm lucky that he is cognitively all there, so I don't have to worry about that. And then he's also married to my stepmother, who is also cognitively all there.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of a blessing because then, I can say to myself, and I guess my therapist said this to me too. She said he is an adult man who can make his own decisions. And so you just have to let him. There's not much you can do. So, and I just say that to say that like everybody's parents are going to be different, and it's okay if it becomes challenging. And I think it's okay if you need to kind of just let it go and let them live their life, even if it gives you anxiety that they're like, my dad and stepmom are living in this house that's falling apart around them and they won't do anything about it, but there's nothing I can do. Do you have any advice for people who maybe they want to talk to their parents about this, but their parents are like, no, I don't want to talk about this? Did you have to deal with that at all with your parents? Did you have to kind of ease them into talking about this?
It's easy to talk about when they're in crisis. I would say that, so my dad was going to work until he said, I'm just going to work until I'm dead, basically. He knew he didn't have a lot saved for retirement or whatever. But, I think that what a lot of people find out, men and women both, is you get to a certain age and really you can't continue in the workforce. I mean, they just will boot you out, and you can go and get some different kind of job. But I mean, ultimately, when he was laid off and they weren't prepared, they had to file bankruptcy. So as they were kind of doing that, and as he sort of needed help from his kids, like we got on a big conference call and he sort of laid everything out as far as what his financial picture was. So that was sort of in crisis. And that's kind of what you want to avoid, because by then it's kind of too late for a lot of things. I wish I had a solution. I would say, I like your advice really, is that if you sort of start early and maybe start even asking about money, not so much approaching them from I know better, but more so from let me ask you some advice. What are you doing? I have this option to do, backdoor Roth or, whatever. If you're having that level of conversation, your parents are probably fine. But I mean, I would say try to approach it maybe from, hey, what are you doing? Because I'm thinking about doing this, right? Some kind of thing where you're kind of maybe asking for advice. So you're taking the judgment away, and you're just sort of, you maybe will accept whatever they say, but just to kind of glean some information, peel back the onion a little bit as to how would they respond to this question. If I said, look, I'm thinking about buying a rental property to secure my retirement or whatever. Did you and mom ever think about buying a rental property? Or, what do you think? Do you think these 401ks are a good idea? Something where you're kind of approaching it from an advice perspective. I think that might be something where it doesn't sort of put them on the defensive. That might be a first step.
That's excellent advice, because I actually, and I have no idea which podcast episode this was because I listen to so many of them, but I think there was actually an expert who said that is the best way to approach money conversations with your parents, is asking them their advice. For example, if you're say 22, 24, and you're just starting your job, if you want to start those conversations with your parents at that time and say, hey, my company offers a 401k. What do you think of 401ks? Do you and mom or do you and dad have a 401k? Like, how did you invest in that? And then it's, like you said, it's opening up for them to want to talk about it, because people love to give advice, right? And then B, you're getting kind of information on their situation, right? And I think you can take some pointers from there, because if they respond with, oh yeah, like we did this, that, and the other thing, and we started at this age, and et cetera, you're like, okay, so they're good. But if they're kind of like, well, I don't know what a 401k is, then you can be like, oh crap, we need to talk about this more often, or if they don't want to talk about it at all, then there's something there.
I mean, they're the generation that doesn't talk about money, right? I mean, that's a big problem anyway. They're the generation that just simply didn't talk about, and our kids won't have this problem because we talk all the time about. So I was trying to teach my kids about the importance of being an owner, of, don't use your salary to buy liabilities, use your salary to buy assets. So we actually even bring up our Fidelity account, and we go, look, let's just bring up 2023 and say, all right, here's our capital gains for the year. Here's our dividends for the year. We did nothing. We went to sleep. We went about our day. This was our money working for us. So it's just really telling them, like, every dollar you put in asset, think of that dollar as an employee. That's one of your, and you're growing your business. And to be able to show them that, look, in 2023, we earned, 4 times what we spent, right? So mom is working, but we just want to show you that, yes, mom is working, but this is what you're building towards. You want to build this up, just keep at it until you get all of this passive income, and then you kind of become work optional. And so we have those conversations with our kids constantly. It's not real yet for them, but I mean, we show them the dollars to help them really conceptualize like that it can be very, very, very real, and so our kids will know our financial situation. And we're, again, the younger one who I said he was stressed out, he didn't have a 401k at the age of 10. He'll be the one that will have a big thumb on our investments and stuff, because I mean, we all love VTSAX and chill, but when I'm 80, who knows whether that's still going to be the right thing that we should all be doing with our money and all of that kind of stuff. And so we're going to involve them pretty early. But just on again, this sort of sandwich thing is that this idea that, yeah, you want to have conversations with your parents in the context of, are they doing the right things for themselves? In other words, if you're in your 20s and your 30s and you are making a pretty good salary and your parents are still sending you $1,500 for Christmas, or so, they may be doing that from a place of love and of being a parent, and that may bring them some level of joy. But if they're not putting their own oxygen mask on first before they are putting one on you, if they are sending you $1,500 because it gives them joy, but they're not putting anything away for their own care and retirement, it's going to be very, very stressful later on, because that's not $1,500. That's $1,500 compounded over the next 20 or 30 years. And if you got multiple siblings. So I would also say, as you're talking with your parents, is to, if you're fine, make sure they know you're fine, and make sure they know that it's important to you that they are doing right by themselves, that they are putting money away, because, like I say, that it's a compounding effect if they haven't done enough, particularly once you get, I think, in your late 40s, 50s, and your parents start to kind of get to an age where, Walton's Mountain doesn't exist. And you'll see things. It's like, well, we used to have multi-generational homes and just all of these kinds of things, but you also had, lifespan was different. All kinds of things were different. You didn't, a lot of times when you had multiple generations, the oldest generation was very able-bodied. They were very able-minded. They were not to such an advanced stage where they might need nursing care and things that, we have evolved to a point where we have to work and we have to make livings. And if they get to a point where they haven't done the things that they need to do, then you're going to have some really tough decisions on their behalf as you get to that age. So, like I say, younger, if there's no reason for them to be sending you money, or because you're fine financially or whatever, then just, make sure they're putting their own oxygen mask on.
Yeah, that's great advice. And even if they refuse to stop sending you money, you could invest it on their behalf.
Yeah.
You could just open an account and be like, you know what, this is my parents' money. I'm going to invest it for them. And then whenever they need, if they don't have the money, then it's not much, right? But at least
Yeah.
it's something that you could potentially, if you have to support them financially, at least you're using the money they gave you and you invested it. So I only get $100 from my dad on my birthday and Christmas. So it's only $200 a year. But I still tell him, you do not need to get me this. And he's like,
Yeah.
well, it's not that I'm giving you money. It's that I'm giving you money to buy a gift for the special occasion, is how he's looking at it. And I'm like, I'm trying to tell you that I don't need a gift. I have no desire. I have 1,000-square-foot house. I can't fit any more crap in this house. I don't need a gift. And so I think I think that's what I'm going to start doing is start saving that. And it's not going to be much, but at least it's something that I could do for them. And I could probably just go back in time and look at how much they've given me and just set that aside now. It's not going to be, like I said, much, but it's something. All right, everybody, that's the end of Alan's episode part 1, where we talked about dealing with being the sandwich generation, how to raise teenage kids, talking to your kids about money, and talking to your aging parents about money. Tune in next week for part 2, where we talk about Alan's personal journey to financial independence when you're after the age of 40 and how that can actually be a good thing. Tune in next week. Thanks for listening to the EverydayFI podcast. If you're loving the show, here are some things you can do. Number 1, subscribe in your favorite podcast player and share the show with your friends and family. Number 2, please leave a review. I'm always looking for ways to improve the show. Number 3, check out my website, EverydayFI.com, where you can listen to all the episodes and leave comments for myself and the guest. Number 4, if you're interested in sharing your own financial independence story, you can find a submission form at everydayfi.com/podcast. And finally, number 5, join my Patreon membership for only $5 a month at patreon.com/everydayfi-podcast. This is a one-woman show, so every little bit counts. See you next time as we continue to go down the path to financial freedom.